On the offbeat. Boom, 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 boom. Come on, jazz, offbeat. Dum, dum, da, dum, ba, dum. It just takes two fingers, people. Come on. Dum, 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 ba, dum, 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 ba, dum, ba, dum, 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 ba, dum, ba, dum, 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 dum.
Should we start?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. You get your beer?
Thank you.
No.
For your wonderful music.
Oh, thank you. Hey everybody. Welcome to Superweek Evening Edition.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, a quiet evening. The one, the only, Kris Ewald.
I have a microphone. Oh, thanks. So good to see so many of you choosing to spend your evening for this little experiment. This is the result of an idea I conceived early summer, I think, and over a really good lunch with Solly up at the Buddha Castle. I pitched the idea to him that instead of a classic talk, I would simply go up here and try and facilitate a conversation with 300 people at once, which is still my crazy, wild idea. So this is not when I plan to speak for half an hour and then we go out and start the big fire. I'm hoping where we can have a conversation. And Solly had the guts to say, yeah, Kris, that's a stupid idea, but let's try and see if it works. So thanks for that. The topic that I wanted to put on the floor is something that those of you that have followed my ramblings on Twitter and in other places for years have sort of maybe seen that I've grown into from working with data for way too long and discussing data in all kinds of strange aspects. And I've come to sort of the realization that we need to have a conversation between us where our clients and everybody else are not in the room. So the premise of this talk is that we agree that we are a community sharing ways of doing things, and that we should have conversations about how we do things. And I've realized that we, in a way, are farmers. We help grow data. We put out the seeds for collection, and we grow it, and we harvest the data. That's what we basically make a living from, right? And sometimes we do that for agencies that do it for clients. Sometimes we do it directly for clients. Sometimes we do it as freelancers. Sometimes we do it simply because we care about it and we can find interesting patterns in the data. Sometimes we do it to protect people when there's a consequence of using the data, right, Aurélie? Yeah. But I think the conversation we need to have is, why is it that we accept helping a lot of companies harvest and use and capitalize on the value of this data without questioning the ethics of exactly that? And that's what I wanted this fireside chat to be about. I don't want to be too serious, and I hope you have your beers and you look a little bit sort of, what the f is the guy talking about? So in plain words, I wanted to start out by just saying, when I started thinking for real about this a couple of years ago, I realized we talk about this all the time. We talk about data as the new oil, right? We talk about data economics or information economics, and information we all know is value and power, if it's turned into knowledge, obviously. But we never really had that conversation about how to actually work with the value of that data. So we have this whole other side of the industry where we do growth hacking and conversion rate optimization, and we drive more business, which we could then sort of calculate backwards and say, you know, that person generated this much value and this action had this much value. And it's all kind of proxies for what it essentially represents is actions that carry transactions between humans and businesses. And all the advertising and all the communications that happen in between is essentially, in my world, an intermediary facilitating a marketplace. And I hope those of you that are economists in the room will agree with me that markets work better when there are fewer intermediaries. So if I'm a little bit cynical, I will argue that advertising was invented because the market was not working in a good way. So it's the least bad way of, you know, lubricating the conversation between people and opportunities from companies. So with data, we should be able to make that less necessary. To actually remove some of the need for the advertising, because we could use the data to help brands be better at talking to consumers at scale without using all the advertising. So one little loop back to my talk from last year, you probably remember, those of you that heard it, my little example of sports shoes, average value when you buy them, what, 100 euros-ish? How much of the 100 euros is the actual value of the shoe? Volunteer figure? $5, that's pretty good, or 5 euros. Something like that, right? 10% of the total value that you pay for the shoe. And then there's a little bit of transportation and maybe some eco offset from some corrupt CO2. Anyway, 10%. What is the rest? The rest is advertising. That's money that we pay that essentially is used to convince us to buy the product that we wanted. I'm sorry, but I find that ridiculous. And I find that we as an industry working with data have an obligation to try and see if we could change that. If we could make the data work to make that less necessary. So data that carries value can be used to make the market work better. But in my approach, I've gone even further than that. I've basically tried to say, let each little piece of data actually carry value. Every action carries an element of value. Can we always measure the exact value? No, because the action that comes out of, or the value that gets generated from that one action maybe doesn't represent the full value. We've had that conversation, I think, when we've discussed metrics for many years here at Superweek. Say lifetime value is a crap metric because it represents the past and not the future, for example, and we should do a predicted future value instead of a past lifetime value. But still, what if we could assign value to the data and then distribute that value in a different way where the consumer is part of the equation? Oh, I killed you. You're totally dead silent. It's fantastic. Amazing. Okay, so we have a topic. Can we start a conversation, please? Joshua, where are you?
I'm over here.
So
I'm already embedded in the crowd.
So what I'm trying to say is there is over here analytics and technologies that can capture data and generate data and make new data from that data, insights derived from it. And then over here, dare I say it, is a new little growing industry using blockchain. Dare I say it. Disclosure, I live in Zug in Switzerland. They call themselves Crypto Valley. In Zug, there are 30,000 people and 800 startups focused on blockchain technologies. I sense something is going on that we should pay attention to. So where does that meet analytics? I think it meets analytics where the old analytics solutions had to aggregate data because the technologies, the databases were not fast enough to capture and store all the raw data. 5 years ago-ish, Snowplow showed up and showed us that we could start to capture event-level data. And now there's a whole plethora of technologies that can handle event-level data in real time and without aggregating it, and just basically storing the full, complete data set. So if that's possible, why not put that on a blockchain? So we can also trust that data, which is what entities like, I call them entities because they're non-profit, IOTA, for example. IOTA is a non-profit organization where the idea is that you can stream your data set into a shared data pool, and then it creates a marketplace for data. Or you have Streamer up in, I think it's Helsinki in Finland. Streamer is the same idea. You could take your data, stream, put it into a data warehouse, and it becomes a marketplace where that data can be traded. So that's a little piece of what I'm trying to say. Why don't we do that? Obviously, probably because we have to respect the privacy of the people that generated that data in the first place. It could also be because it doesn't really change the game. It just means that companies like, I think Samsung, for example, have said that they want all their tools to feed data into a pool like that. Or some of the big car companies want the cars to feed that data in. It doesn't really change the game when it's still the corporations, the brands that take the data that we've generated with our use and feed it in and capitalize even more on it. So I think I'll start the opening ramble by saying, why is it that we, all of us, accept that on average our data represents around $200 of value per place where we generate that data? Google gets $200 out of my data a year. Facebook gets $200. Instagram gets $200. That's the amount of value that I generate with my data. And what do I get in return? I get the use of a service that costs less than $5 to produce. I would call that a ripoff. And for some strange reason that is beyond me, we accept that ripoff. And we don't challenge it. So, let's have that conversation. Ivan, please.
Hi. Basically, you reminded me of the Tim Berners-Lee initiative of the solid.
Yeah.
On one side, but also on the other side, I've seen also some of the startups that already created some sort of prototypes of this based on blockchain, that are actually working towards this, and it makes sense. People would like to see the ads and stuff like that, but it's not used in the right way. So where the cost or the revenue is shared, it makes completely sense.
So are you familiar with the reference, Tim Berners-Lee's project? It's called Solid. The idea of Solid is that it generates a database with a table that they call a pod, a personal data object. And the idea there is that that data object belongs to each individual person. What I love about that project, and if you saw my talk last year, I was playing with it for a project that I've been running, and we're still playing with it. What I love about it is that you can actually control access to the data on a record level in that table. You can choose to share pieces of that data set and say, this record I want to share with this entity, and you can timestamp it and say, but they can only look it up once, so they can look it up for the next 30 seconds or something like that, and then it's gone again. What I didn't like about it is that it still stores the data in a centralized server. So what we've been trying to do on top of their open source licenses, we've been trying to see if we could even, within the licensing rights, distribute it and say each individual person should actually carry a pod server on our phones and have our pods plugged into that. And what I want to get to, and this is where we get to one of my crazy ideas, I want to get to a place where we insist that every time we give data to a third party, with all the 50 tags running on all the sites I go to, I want a copy of that data. It's very simple. I want to have the same data that I give to them into my pod. I don't know yet exactly what I'm going to use it for. That's what we have to figure out as an industry. But I'm pretty sure that if I had that data set for the last 15 years, I could have a much better profile about what I actually care about than all these derived profiles if you go to Rich Relevance or Live Intent or Audience Project or LiveRamp, all of those companies that have hundreds of millions of people cookied. Can we have a swear jar for the word cookie? Cookies are dead, right?
Wrong conference.
That's measure can. Okay. Anyway, all these companies are building our profiles. Have you ever checked your profile? Was it good? Sorry? Yes. You checked it and it was good? That's not my experience. My experience is that it's pretty bad. Because it thinks that just because I search for cartoons for my kids, I care about cartoons. Sorry, can you use the mic?
Well, you're researching the cartoons for your kids, so in a way you do care for cartoons.
Yes, true. But it should still be aware that a 40-something-year-old person probably doesn't watch cartoons all the time.
Why not?
I know, generalization is always dangerous. Okay, okay, but you're right. I'm just trying to make the argument that I think because they want us to not know that they're profiling us, the profiles are not as good as they could be if they asked us. And they don't want to ask us because they don't want us to know that we're profiled, because then we would probably opt out for very good reasons. Right?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to come back to what you said about. I like your vision. I like the way forward, that we own our own data. And you talk about markets, but the reality is that Google and Facebook basically have a monopoly. That's not a fair market now. So if you want to create a market, you should get rid of the monopolies first, right?
That sounds like the dealer argument, right? You got me hooked,
yeah.
And now I'm hooked, so I can't opt out again?
How do you go about, what's your vision about like moving into that direction? About changing the situation we have now with monopolies?
I think it's a really good argument. What is it? More than half of global digital advertising money goes into those two boxes, right? For good reason, of course. I'm pragmatic enough to think, even if I deleted the Facebook app many years ago already, myself, that we won't stop using it, because there are benefits also. So I'm pragmatic enough to think that of course they will keep existing, but I think at some point, if we could make it happen in the rest of the world, that we said we want to have our own data, doesn't mean that we will stop sharing it with them. We just want to start with that little step of capturing it ourselves as well. I think at some point it could be that we had enough negotiation power, if you will, to turn it upside down and say, I want all my Facebook data in a format that I could build a converter and actually dump it into a pod. I mean, I have the right to request an extraction from Facebook already. They'll probably send me, I don't know, a 2,000-page PDF. But why not? Why not have it in some form where I could actually put it into a data object and take it with me? The philosophy in Tim Berners-Lee's project is that you should be able to unplug your pod from a server if you don't like that environment and plug it into another server. Or, shift it from time to time. Or again, as I said, on record level, you can choose who you want to share it to. So I think at some point that might happen, that we start distinguishing between having an identity that allows us to use a service from that service. I think what they were really brilliantly smart at was that they baked it into one cake. Said to use this, you also have to use this identity.
Do you think regulation is the answer? Do you think regulation is the answer to change that?
So I'm an economist. I believe in markets and clearing, and no, I'm naive enough to think that there will be identity solutions around that will give us part of what we need. The question is, of course, will these big corporates accept those identities? I don't know if regulation is needed. I'm sure regulation is needed in something else, which is, of course, to help us protect ourselves from what we are not aware of today. Derived value of the data that we are sharing.
Kris,
There's a question down in the back.
Yeah, I just would ask you if you might be able to, for me, dumb it down a little bit in terms of like a concrete example. What does it, I know, sorry. What does that transaction look like? If I have my pod, where is there a financial transaction that either impacts me and from whom? Where's the money transferring?
Now let's start somewhere else. Let's say the fact that you travel from where you live to here every year, that's a piece of data that's pretty interesting for an airline. It represents an opportunity to sell you a flight for your whole family once a year, right? That piece of information today goes to the airline. And that airline could, of course, use it to target you and say, hey, it's that time of year. Let's try and see if we can sell you a flight. But if you were able to hold a piece of data in a pod that said, I plan to travel at this time in the future, I plan to buy a new car, or I'm going to buy new shoes, or whatever it is. And maybe it was even automatic. I think we are a lot of good data scientists in the room. I'm pretty sure you could build prediction models on my data set that would say, by this time next year, he has probably bought this, this, and this. And then I could say, yeah, yes, or definitely, or maybe not. So I think where the business comes in is, what if I could choose to share that with providers and say, I will give you access to that data, and in exchange for that, I want a good offer. I'm actually going to tell you whether or not I plan to fly. And it's much better quality data because it comes from me. And then they could use it to give me a good offer. And they could save a bunch of advertising money.
Okay. So my question.
Sorry, did that answer Joshua's example? Yeah?
Okay, he's happy.
Go for it.
All right. So I'm Ole from Berlin, and I was wondering, I think, and I would probably guess a lot of people would agree that one of the big problems is the mass of data that is collected about us and then stored in other people's databases. Mm-hmm. So now I'm wondering you gave some sort of example which really not has convinced me very much, to be honest. So I'm collecting now an even bigger, better, complete and correct profile of data about myself. What would I actually do with it? Because in your example, I could show or prove I'm planning to do that trip. In a market, I would guess I wouldn't get a discount because they know I will do that trip. So why give me a discount? And the downside is that now I have this huge mass of very correct, complete data about myself, and I don't see any upsides. I only see the danger that this might be leak out. I lose my pod, I lose access to my pod, people lose access to their crypto wallets all the time, and then somebody has even better, even more complete information about myself.
I'm not trying to convince anybody. I'm just saying there are reasons for why, for some pieces of data, it's really practical that we keep them ourselves. Like I still have my little cardboard-based thing from childhood where all my vaccinations were stamped into, right? I'm pretty happy I have that because I could take it with me when I immigrated from Denmark to Switzerland and give it to the Swiss doctor and say, hey, these are the vaccinations I had. And they were not in some strange system somewhere. Just as an example, there are data pieces that it's practical to have ourselves. I'm just trying to go from that and extrapolate further and say, I don't know yet all the use cases. I just have this idea of philosophy that I can see that it represents tremendous value for the companies that I give my data to today. They've been able to capitalize on it. And they are not fair in their sharing of that value back to me. So I'm just thinking, if I took more control of the data by taking ownership of it, I could probably, at the very least, get a better deal and get a bigger piece of the pie. Then we can always see down the road what we can do with the data. I don't have that yet. I'm pretty sure that is something we will figure out in the next 10 years. And when we are here in 2030, I'm pretty sure we will laugh and say, ah, we never thought about that thing or that thing or that thing. Yeah?
I'm tempted to take you on that bet.
Sorry?
I'm tempted to take you on that bet.
I would love to.
So disclaimer, I work for government, and I would like to relate to two things that you've said. In the identity and access management industry, there is a trend called self-sovereign identity.
Yes.
That is basically what you were saying about owning your data. And the other thing that is interesting...
Sorry, I think, again, layman's, explain what it means.
Self-sovereign identity is basically the idea that a citizen or a customer, depending on what kind of system we talk about, owns the data and may expand it, declarative or based on data pulled from other sources. Another thing that you may find interesting is that there is a regular...
Sorry, can I add on it?
Yeah.
I think also important is that you can have an identity that was not issued by a commercial interest. It's a self-sovereign identity. I can use it to prove that I'm me, but I'm not locked in to do that by saying log in with Google or log in with Facebook.
What you may find interesting is that there is an ongoing regulation in the European Union that is called ADAS, and basically this will force all members of the European Union to have electronic identities. I introduced it in Poland last year, where Polish IDs already have a chip on it, with all the basic data that you have on the ID, and we are trying to build commercial services on top of it, where a citizen may expand the data, for example, with like address details and so on. And we are trying to build a service that will allow citizens to, for example, let's say that I want to open a new insurance account. The idea is to put your electronic ID to your smartphone so that all the data from the ID will be pulled and will be automatically confirmed and verified by your government.
Yeah, and I think it's actually already in Android, in beta. The support for these self-sovereign IDs.
It was implemented in the last iOS update where we can use the NFC protocol to pull the data from electronic IDs. So we can pass on both through iOS and Android.
Exactly. And that combined with something that happened in the blockchain space of things within the last couple of years, which is zero data proofs, right? That you can prove something without actually exchanging data. Gives us a new thing. We didn't have that a couple of years ago, where you don't necessarily swap data with the counterparty.
Actually, there is one reason why this kind of data won't be put on blockchain, on the funny note is that it's because government agencies that deal with security, they want to be able to edit data, for example, for their intelligence agents and so on. And because of that, it won't be possible to put on blockchain, or they will do two layers, one for citizens or one for the intelligence services.
And that's why if you remember my talk from last year, I got to the conclusion, also talking to the privacy people, that because you can't respect the right to be forgotten on a blockchain, because you simply cannot remove a record, they will never be the answer by themselves, which is why I try to combine a blockchain with Tim Berners-Lee's pods. Say, let's put the private data in the pod where we can actually remove the record, and then just use the blockchain for a log that has a, unquestionable log of events that happened. But I think, and again, to give a very concrete example to, if you are sort of still a little bit, what is the guy talking about? Let me ask you a super basic question. How many % of the traffic that you capture in Google Analytics for your clients' websites is unidentified today?
22.34%.
I would say more. On a random web shop, how many % of the people that land on a random web shop can you recognize today? Sorry?
Most of it is unrecognizable.
Most of it is unrecognizable. Is it going to be better or worse with intelligent cookie prevention? worse. So what does it tell us? It tells us that let's just make a rough guesstimate and say at least half of all the traffic that goes to a website, we don't know who those people are. And when we're losing cookies, we can't even say if we saw them before or not. So a super basic example of what I'm trying to say is, what if I offered people a super tiny and small amount of value instantly given if they shared their identity at the time they landed on the website?
But it sounds like the incentive is too small.
No.
You already mentioned that the super small incentive in exchange for, for their information, for personal information. So in this case, right now I'm trying to understand from this chat is like, what is it for me? Because like, just getting some personalized offer doesn't always sound like enough to provide more precise information.
No, but the answer, so first of all, we have to agree whether or not sharing your ID against some amount of value would be relevant. And I'm just saying, as analysts, I think it would help us tremendously if we had a higher percent of the traffic identifiable. Right?
Offer a sign in on the website and demonstrate that you can offer value, you're going to get the new ID and the consent.
So
Sure.
I have an example from Belgium exactly.
Let's take the example, yeah.
So in Belgium, there's a startup at the moment. They're called Cake, and they're a banking app. So not from one of the big banks, but they use the new regulation that banks should share payment information with each other if the client wants to. So what they offer for the customer, for us, is they provide an app which will, if you link all your financial institutions to it, it will provide you better insights in your spending behavior. It will give you tips and all those kind of things. And next to that, they tell you, we will use that data to build a profile and monetize that profile. So they become a broker, and they promise us a part of the return that we're making will go back to the users. So as a user, you know your data is being sold. You get insights in what the data is, and you get a return on it. So that's their business model, and it's something that a lot of people are very enthusiastic about at the moment. So we'll see in a couple of months if it's really becoming something, but it will be things like that, I think, that where not every individual will become a data broker, but we will have parties collecting that data and be the data broker in our name, instead of just Google taking our data and selling it.
Yeah, I see it the same way. I've argued it's exactly like if you have a flat that you don't use all the time, you list it with Airbnb. Airbnb helps you get it rented out. That doesn't mean you give up the rights to your apartment. It just means that you declare that for this period of time, there's a value that I'm not using, let someone else use it and give me part of that value back. I totally agree. That's the way to go, and that's why we should have that data set. Sure?
So I'm going to have the unpopular opinion that we're a bunch of nerds. And we're here in our ivory tower discussing what the world of privacy should be like. But that's another topic. I think the thing that needs to come before like all that brokering, the pod, and first of all, the fire is dying. So it's no longer a fireside discussion.
Yeah. We'll wrap it in 5 minutes.
I think the most crucial part of this discussion is about educating the masses. Because we're trading off data for convenience. We don't want to click that button that says, yes, please list me all the use cases for my data. We just click accept and just say, F it. No one read the small print and what the consent provides. It's like the Apple user agreement. So I think there's an education effort to be made globally, or if at least just Europe, say we're collecting your data. No one outside of this room gives a f about GDPR. So I think we need to have a lot more education in junior high school to make sure that the kids of today become the consumers of tomorrow, but educated consumers. and that they know that their data can be placed into the blockchain, placed into a pod. It can be used, it can be monetized, they can get a return from it, but I think we're very far from doing this like for people outside this room.
I 100% disagree on that. Okay. I think it's the other way around. I think people will do it because they realize that there is an immediate direct value that you can insist on getting.
Yeah, but how do you communicate around that?
It's super simple. You're being screwed. You shouldn't be. It's behavioral economics. Sure. The point of behavioral economics isn't the amount of money. It's the feeling that you're getting cheated. That feeling is really strong. And if we can get that sentiment out, that these companies are capitalizing on our data and we are being screwed, and I think that will spread, it starts there. And it starts on a super low practical level for me. It doesn't have to be super fancy. It's the simple thing that we agree that cookie blocking is a good thing because it prevents unwanted cross-domain tracking, etc., etc. But the only reason we think it's evil is because it was done without our strict consent. If we put it on a token and we use the blockchain, it's a transaction. It's actually signed by the receiver and the sender, which means it's very explicit opt-in. You decided to accept an amount of value in exchange for your ID. And it would help everybody. It's actually good for the consumer to do it, but the consumer can choose not to. And I've had the feedback from a lot of peers. So you want to bribe me to share my data? So no, of course not, because we'll be transparent. You have all the power in the world to say no thanks. For a period of time, I thought I would also try and experiment with a donate button and say, at least acknowledge that it has this value, and then choose to say, I don't want it. I know that it represents it, but I will donate it to something good. Instead of just blindly giving it to someone else that extorts us. Yeah?
So as a commercial entity, right, how do I assess the value of a data set that's locked behind a paywall? And how do I build use cases with that data which is not available? And do I pay for that data upfront and just have that arbitrary, just pay that arbitrary value upfront? Or how does that work even? And if we have data brokers in the middle, will it always keep prompting me that, hey, do you want to share data? Do you want to share data? And do we actually trust consumers to actually trust, do we trust consumers with their own data in such cases?
No, I'm sure we need a validation mechanism where you can't just declare that you're a billionaire and get all the good deals. Funny enough, billionaires get better deals than poor people, right?
That's not very funny.
No, it's sad actually. I think if I understand your question, I think a simple way to answer it is to say the classic example would be, what is the value worth? What is the amount of value that a doubling of the conversion rate would represent? If you have a paywall, I'm sure there's a block to get people to pass the paywall.
Yep, but access to data doesn't guarantee a doubling of conversion rates.
No, of course not. No. It doesn't guarantee it, but if you could quantify, you could probably trade. I've seen examples. It was actually called Sharewall. They've shut down now, but it was a startup that tried to say, instead of paying for access to newspaper articles with money, why not just pay with sharing? Because that also represents advertising value back to the publisher. So they said, in exchange for getting access to this article, you have to share with 3 other people that have to watch the ad, which you can see in an experiment called the Brave browser. Have any of you played with the Brave browser?
I was going to ask you the same thing, the token.
The basic attention token is a totally flawed approach to solving this, where they want to capture the value of our eyeballs and distribute that value back to the publishers. But it's dead in the, I don't know what you call it.
Water.
In my world, dead in the water.
Dead in the water. So I'm also very excited to announce that Kris will be here in the lobby for the next 4.5 hours to be discussing on a one-on-one.
That's right.
And whoever would like to speak. Tomorrow morning, first of all, a nice quiet round of applause that's full of energy inside. Thanks. Kris Ewald.